Hey guys, this is Sarah Burnett, and this is the content presentation for week 2 on social perception. This module covered the perplexities of the self, how we view ourselves, how we compare ourselves to others, and how we attempt to understand other people's behavior. The understandings we have of who we are may seem natural and integrated into our DNA, but the process of self-evaluation is actually very complex. These processes likely arose through evolution for adaptation and survival purposes, but they are still very much a fundamental part of how we gain insight to ourselves and others. The readings this week from the Casson textbook, the Chatty Theory book, and the articles by Valkenburg and Laxniak thoroughly explored all of these concepts. So in this presentation, I will focus on just a few of the topics from this week's readings. I will look at culture, self-esteem, the social comparison theory, the attribution theory, and the covariation theory. It's important, of course, to consider cultural differences when we're looking at how people perceive themselves and others, because different societies hold different views. For instance, individualist versus collectivist societies. Individualist societies tend to be Western societies where the self is a separate entity, it's distinct, it's autonomous, they are self-contained, and they are unique. So that's generally how we are here in America. We are our own self, and outside of our circle, we have our family and our friends and our job, etc. This is the independent view of self. But in other countries like China, Japan are good examples. They have an interdependent view of self. So their self is part of a larger network. So, if you're looking at it, kind of as a big bubble chart, their self is in the middle, and then they have their families and friends and coworkers. Their circles are overlapping with their self, so they are part of a larger network. So how they view themselves very much depends on how integrated they are into their network of people. Culture also changes generationally, So we can see that even in our society, how we have changed from the Casson textbook put it as generation we to generation me. So we are becoming more autonomous, some would say self-centered. So this we saw it in the Valkenburg article on the adolescence and social networking and how it affected their self-esteem. The cultural differences are definitely something to consider there. So this particular study was done in the Netherlands, so we might consider how this study would generalize to other countries, whether they are a collectivist or individualist society. And also, the study was from 2006, so I think it would be safe to say even from 2006 to present day, 2018, there's probably already been somewhat of a shift in the generation and the population. So these are definitely things to consider when we're looking at these studies and when we're researching how we view ourselves and others. Our self-esteem is dependent upon our own dissonance between who we think we ought to be versus who we believe we could ideally be. These are known as our ought self and our ideal self. We actually tend to maintain a positive image of ourselves, and we even hold a self-bias where we think of ourselves as better than average. Obviously, this is statistically impossible. We can't all be better than average, but that is a self-serving bias that we hold. The sociometer theory states that our desire for self-esteem, for positive self-esteem, is rooted in our biology, And as social beings, we have a need to connect with others and to gain other people's approval. However, as we read in Valkenberg's article on adolescents and their social networking, there can be a negative impact on our self-esteem when we fail to gain the approval of others. When this occurs, the dissonance between our alt self and our ideal self strengthens, and then we have to work to rebuild our positive self-esteem. Casson explained the social comparison theory as the way people evaluate their own abilities and opinions by comparing themselves to others. Being honest, we could probably all admit to engaging in comparisons, oftentimes even subconsciously. In the Chatty chapter on social comparisons, they stated that comparing ourselves to others is a fundamental psychological mechanism. Festinger hypothesized that humans engage in comparison to maintain a stable self-view. We do this by comparing ourselves to different persons for different reasons. So, for example, we would compare ourselves to someone similar to us in order to gain knowledge about ourselves. We may make a downward comparison, so an inferior other, in order to feel better about ourselves. Or we could make an upward comparison, so we would compare ourselves to a superior other when we're seeking self-improvement. Each comparison provides us with feedback that we then use to make decisions in our everyday lives. The attribution theory describes how people perceive the cause of a behavior. We generally make one of two attributions: person or situation, depending on the context of the situation. So personal attributes are factors of the person themselves, so it could be their personality, their ability, or their effort, whereas situational attributes focus on factors outside of the person. So it could be other people, or the economy, or even luck. The fundamental attribution error explains how people tend to over-apply personal attributions and underestimate situational factors when perceiving causality. So that just means that we tend to blame the person themselves for an action or behavior before thinking about outstanding factors that could have influenced their behavior. So when I think of that, I think of jumping to conclusions, which, speaking for myself, we do a lot. The covariation theory outlines three components that we use to assess which attribution to apply, so personal or situational. And those three components are consensus, do others agree, distinctiveness, is it specific to this situation or product, and consistency, did they have a similar experience every time? In the Laxniak study of word-of-mouth communication, they found that participants in their study on the effects of negative word-of-mouth communication on a specific personal computer brand were more likely to make situational attributions, so that would be attributing it to the brand of the computer, when the communicator had high consistency, high consensus, and high distinctiveness. So, meaning others agreed, so many other people thought that the computer was subpar. It had high distinctiveness, so it was specific to this product. They weren't saying that all products were bad, all computers were awful. And high consistency, so they did have a similar experience with this product every single time. So in those situations of negative word-of-mouth communication, so a negative rating of this PC brand, they blamed the brand itself. However, they were more likely to make personal attributions, so they would attribute the bad rating to the communicator themselves if they were high in consistency but low in consensus and distinctiveness. So this person, the negative reviewer had a similar experience every time, meaning they had negative reviews of many brands many times. However, they were low in consensus, so nobody else agreed, or very few people agreed, and low in distinctiveness, so it was not specific to this product. So you can see how that makes sense, how we use these other factors, these other components, to kind of gauge if it's the person themselves, in which we would apply a personal attribution, or if it is indeed an external factor where we would make a situational attribution. These discussion questions are also posted on the discussion board, but I included them here also. So the first one, in Chapter 3 of the Casson textbook, they explore the pros and cons of realism versus illusion. While maintaining positive illusions may increase a person's self-esteem, they may risk their relationships with others by appearing arrogant or gloated. On the other hand, realists tend to be more accurate in their self-evaluations and predictions of their futures, but they usually suffer from lower self-esteem. So which framework do you think is more adaptive, realism or illusion? Use evidence from the text to support your answer. This week we learned about the social comparison theory, how we as individuals evaluate our own abilities and opinions through a process of comparing ourselves to others. In the chatty text, we read about Festinger's social comparison theory and his assertion that this process is fundamental to human nature and adaptive in order to assimilate to the culture. On the other hand, we read in Valkenburg's article on the relationship between social networking and adolescent self-esteem that there were aversive effects on the self-esteems of adolescents who received negative feedback on their social networking profiles. 2 Corinthians 10:12 says, "We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise." What position do we as Christian scientists take on the contradictory views of the social comparison theory? When reflecting on the theories from this module, some of the concepts I could recall consciously engaging in, such as making comparisons to similar, superior, or inferior others. However, other elements of the social self, such as the self-bias that I talked about or the covariation theory, these processes seem much more subconscious, though like after thinking about them, I could recall certain times when I had used it, but unknowingly at the time. All of these processes allow us to evaluate the behaviors of ourselves and others and gain insight on who we are or who we want to be. The complexities of the self are fundamental to humans as social beings and are arguably still as adaptive today as they were in the beginning of time.